10x your service design offering with Smapply. Take 20% off any order with This Is HCD 20 off. Let's superpower you and your design team's potential. Sign up at smapply.app. Enjoy the episode from your friends at Smapply, helping support This Is HCD podcast.
Thea Kleinmagd is a circular material chains innovator at Fairphone. When you're buying your next smartphone, please consider Fairphone. They make excellent modular and repairable products that are built to last. I started our chat by asking Thea to describe the potential toxic impacts of some of the over 50 materials found in a typical smartphone.
Yeah, so maybe first good to understand is that for each of our phones, we conduct a so-called life cycle assessment, which analyzes the environmental impacts of a product. And mostly you hear about such LCAs when the conversation is about greenhouse gas emissions. But an LCA also looks at other impact categories. And in our case, we also choose to look, among others, at human toxicity and on ecotoxicity. And from our LCA, we know that more than 70% of human and ecological toxicity is caused in the production phase of a phone. And to determine these toxic impacts relating to a specific material, you need to dig very deeply into the analysis. However, the materials in the phone are not necessarily the toxic substances themselves. So it can be that substances used in production, they are the ones also causing health impacts, and also, for example, related to the energy generation of the product, and also through the use of toxic materials, for example, at mining sites. So the gold, for example, in the phone, that is often washed out from the ore using mercury. And that's, of course, I assume everyone knows, a very toxic and unhealthy substance to work with. And this is also a reason why Fairphone focuses on prolonging the lifespan of smartphones, because the longer we use one phone, the less phones we need to produce over time. Thus, we avoid the toxic substances from being emitted into our environment, even more than if we would produce more phones and use more phones over time. And then it's also that the European Union restricts the use of certain hazardous substances to prevent or limit the amount of toxic materials in products. But there are many countries which don't have such legislation in place. So that means that products can contain very toxic materials. And one material, for example, is lead, which is still used in phones, but in low limits also according to this legislation which is in place here. For example, in the printed circuit boards or also in the LCD screens. And that's a heavy metal that accumulates in the human body over time and can have irreversible damage to the nervous system. Or another problematic substance are also flame retardants. And these are also like very hazardous materials and also hard to recycle if a phone is recycled, because they basically spread through the different plastics that if you want to recycle them, and this plastic is later on, for example, used for food application, that would really not be desirable, because you don't want to have these flame retardants in your food.
I suppose connected with that is that there's so many materials packed in such a small area that it does cause recycling challenges, doesn't it? And they're so intermixed and bonded.
Yeah, exactly. Mm-hmm.
So in the dumping, let's say, because the overall estimates I see is that electronics, less than 20% are recycled. So a lot of them ends up in dumps environment. And somebody said to me that a piece of electronics is almost like a mini nuclear power plant, at a much smaller scale, but that if it's not carefully looked after at the end of its life, that a lot of its toxicity or its damage will continue on for tens of thousands of years potentially with some of the materials in it, if it's just, thrown into the soil or thrown into the water. Any, area, have you looked into that, or the areas of, that is most damaging, so to speak, if the phone is not recycled and it's just thrown into a dump or thrown into the, or ends up in a river or someplace like that?
Yeah, it's indeed the question, what happens at the end of a phone's life to it? So what are then the impacts that this has? And yeah, as you already said, that electronic waste is the fastest growing waste stream, and there is only 20% properly recycled. So some even say that it's just 15% for smartphones specifically. And if it is environmentally sound disposed, then there is not such a big issue. But there are quite a few which end up, for example, in household waste. So they are just dumped into the wrong bin. But that also means that the phone directly takes a different route to recycle. So rather goes into base metal recycling. And these processes are not focused on taking care of hazardous materials and preventing them from escaping into the environment. And that means that if a phone ends up in the household waste, then often such hazardous substances can escape from the processes. And then also if they are, for example, disposed of or illegally exported to country with a lack of environmentally sound recycling system, so for example, many countries in Africa, then often phones end up in a landfill first, or they are treated in the informal sector. So then they are recycled, but the conditions are very polluting and very unhealthy for the people that work in this sector. And for example, then it is that often the plastics of the phone is just burned, so this releases toxic emissions into the air, and that also comes down again on the soil and the water. And also there, mercury is often used to wash the gold out, or to get the gold out of the electronics in there. And so it is very dependent on which route a phone takes, what the toxic emissions and impacts is that are related to it.
Some great points you brought up there, but the illegal exporting as well, and that the life of the phone, goes on and on if it's not properly cared for. I recently did a podcast with Professor Josh Lebowski in Canadian University, and he does a lot of research on materials manufacturing of electronics. And he was saying that there's too much material complexity in modern electronics, which makes it very problematic to recycle or reuse or repurpose in positive ways. Has Fairphone tried to, say, reduce the materials in its phones, to be a leader in that sense, that we don't need as many materials as we are often using in the design of our phones and other electronics?
Yeah, rather than on the number of materials, we are focused on which materials are being used and how they are being sourced. So meaning for us that we have determined 14 focus materials where we look at the, of course, functional aspect, but also social and environmental aspects of how they are produced, and focusing on those where we can have the most impact in the supply chain, where we can proactively work with people on the ground to decrease the impacts that those materials have. And we also published our so-called fair material sourcing roadmap, where you can see on which materials we focus. And aside from that, we are, of course, also always trying to phase out materials that are potentially hazardous, but not vital to the functionality of the phone. rather than necessarily reducing the number of materials, that can also mean swapping them out for an alternative with similar functionality, but then lower social and or environmental impacts.
Would you have any example or recent example of that, of how you managed to swap out a material?
It depends also on the technology you use. So, for example, if you have in some technologies you use rather silicon, and if you switch to a different technology, then gallium becomes the important element. But it is, let's say, when you look at the product as a whole, it is hard to just pinpoint it to this is why we replace this material. So it is because it is more environmentally unfriendly, because it all plays together then also with the functionality, and sometimes you cannot combine the one with the other. So I wouldn't say that there is an example where you can just pinpoint it to we exchanged this material because of the environmental impact, because it is the whole box. It is very complex how these decisions are made.
To make a phone vibrate requires three rare earth materials, three distinct, and probably more. I'm just wondering, I think I could live without a vibrating phone if I knew that impact, is there an awareness, or do you think in the future that we could say, well, we could go for a simpler phone and it would have these positive impact and we'd need these three less materials? Is there any conversations? I know the public wants, but maybe if we got educated that, hey, to get your vibrating phone requires three distinct rare earth materials. Is there any sort of conversations there?
Yeah, this of course depends on the type and design of the phone. So, and also, let's say what target group you have. Some might be completely fine with a non-vibrating phone, but others might not. And so you would, I think, really need to be in the right market segment to just leave away your vibration motor in a phone. Yeah, but for most mined metals, it does not really look like we will be able to easily replace those material anytime soon. And yeah, as mentioned before, decreasing the need for materials through using the phones would decrease the toxicity impacts also, and also just the impacts in general on the environment of smartphones. The most effective, since 70% of these impacts are caused in the production phase. So secondary materials might have a lower impact, but urban mining cannot meet the growing demand for these materials. So therefore, only looking also at, let's say at replacing materials will not solve the problem, because sometimes this will just lead to shifting the problems. But we really need to look also at the lifetime of the phone, that we just need to produce less of them and not just trying to remove certain materials and continuing to produce as many phones as we do right now.
Yeah, that seems to be a key and crucial message, that we use the materials for as long as possible. I'm not sure this is true, but I read somewhere that there were up to 1,000 substances in a phone that separate from materials or that were involved either in the manufacturing or in the phone itself. So aside from the materials, I know you mentioned the flame retardants and as one example. Is there a lot more in the phone world, either the manufacturing, than just the materials?
Yeah, for sure. There are a lot of substances used around the phone, so during the production method. But it's also, so what I'm right now not sure about is if you mean the different substances in terms of a combination of the elements in the phone, or just, let's say, taking a higher level view on all the materials which are moved to produce a phone.
Yeah, I wasn't 100% sure from reading the article. I found 1,000 substances to be an extraordinary number. I suppose what was meant was everything involved in making the chemicals and the whole everything that went into getting that phone ready, so to speak, to ship to market. You mentioned earlier in the introduction that even though you don't, it may be to get one of the materials, there was many other materials used in the mining process or whatever. It can be a very complex picture, but I think we're not aware of how complex these phones are, how big an impact they have on the earth, and demanding of so much stuff, whether chemicals, materials are in the process. And it's just to kind of make people a bit aware that there's an awful lot that goes into this phone we hold in our hands.
No, there for sure, 1,000 substances is very realistic, or more. I cannot pinpoint it to a certain number, but already for just producing one phone, you move 75 kilograms of material. So meaning, for example, the ore that you have to dig from the ground to get the actual elements or materials from it, but then also the fuel used or additional cleaning detergents and just substances which are needed throughout the production. And if you think of that, we produce 1.4 billion of phones every year, and multiply that by 75 kilograms, it is a huge amount of material that we move for one phone, and also a lot of very different materials that we would usually not connect to a smartphone, but that are part of the supply chain of a phone and getting the materials that are inside the phone.
You mentioned earlier that the recycling rate for phones could be as low as 15%, and certainly probably not more than 20%. And then another interesting thing, I think it was on your website that you wrote about it, or somebody in Fairphone wrote about it, that even what is recycled, we only get back 30 to 40% of useful materials. Could you just explain that a little bit, in why we only get it back? Even if we recycle it, we still lose 70% of what's there, so to speak.
Smartphones are very complex devices, and they often only contain tiny amounts of a certain material per device. And therefore, it is very difficult to separate the materials in there. Our design, so Fairphone is a modular phone, can help with that to make the separation easier. But in general, it is still that the recycling system is not really made for that. So what happens currently usually is that phones without the batteries are thrown into a shredder. And then afterwards, you have several separation technologies that will sort the parts, the shredded parts, according to the different materials. So for example, you have ferrous materials which will stick to a magnet. And if you have a part still attached to it which contains gold, then this will probably not be recycled, because this part will end up in the ferrous material processing line. And like this, you lose a lot of materials. And also because the system is not really made for all the different materials that we have in products nowadays. In the last decades, there have so many more materials been used than when our recycling system was planned. So back then, some materials just simply didn't play a role in our product, so that they were not discussed for being recycled. And it takes long to, let's say, adjust such a big system to it. And also generally the processes are targeted to recover certain materials, which means that others which were not separated are lost in the process. And you will also never process or recover 100% of a material, because there is always something which gets lost. And in general, also just more or less a handful of material, mostly precious materials, because those sort of pay for their own processing when you sell them afterwards. And other materials which are rather scarce, but they don't have a high price on the market. They are from a financial perspective not really worth recovering. And this is also why then the recycling doesn't focus on those.
I read that somewhere that someone was saying that some of the materials are in such small quantities in the phones that in essence they disappear from use. They remain in the environment, but they're at such small quantities that they're essentially no longer reusable again. So we're losing, because when, as you say, we were making 1.4 billion a year, that we're losing certain materials that we will not be able to, find or reuse again.
Yeah, and 1.4 billion times a tiny bit is then already really a lot.
Yeah, and that we have like 15 billion, I think, phones since 2007. So it does add up, and so that could cause scarcity in the future of certain materials that essentially become invisible or unrecoverable.
Yeah, indeed. Or just the environmental impacts related to certain materials. For example, rare earths are currently not really recovered in our current system. And they sound rare from their name, but they actually are not. That they are very abundant in our Earth's crust, but it is hard to find the right concentrations for them. And they are also associated with radioactive material that you have to also extract. So the pollution related to those materials is very high. So it is also not desirable that even if we have them to extract them, that we extract all of it. So we should just be more frugal with the resources that we have, and also if that means that we just leave some of them underground and use our products just way longer so that we need less.
I'm just quoting you here. I think I'm quoting you, and you say we must make smart, and you've been saying it anyway, in this talk, we must make smartphones that last longer, more durable, and are able to be repaired without sending it to the shop. Can you, and you have talked a little bit, but the design approach or the philosophy that, you take, because, I think it's, in a way, it's certainly the opposite of planned obsolescence, that sort of philosophy. Could you talk just a little bit the design approach or the philosophy that allows you to think about that throughout the entire design and repair process?
Yeah, so for us, it's really important that the longer a product is used, the fewer new products we need to manufacture, and through that, the less resources we use and also the less greenhouse gases we cause. And this is why the Fairphone is repairable, and that's achieved by modularity, meaning that, for example, now the Fairphone 4 can be opened without tools. And then because of the modular design, you can remove and exchange 8 different parts easily at home. This means that you will not be without a phone since you don't need to leave it at the shop. And that might sound like a small issue, but we are nowadays so used to having our phone at hand all the time that it can prevent a phone from being repaired if you first need to send it to the shop or leave it there for 2 days until the repairer found the time to replace the part. And of course, that also increases the cost of repair if you have to hand it in somewhere. And if you can easily do it on your own in a few minutes, and then you pay a reasonable price when ordering at our homepage, it is very fast and a cost-effective repair. And then it's not just about the hardware, but especially for smartphones, also software plays a really important role. And for Fairphone 4, the software support is guaranteed until the end of 2026. So that includes then also upgrades to Android 12 and Android 13. And we also still aim to extend it further until the end of 2028. And also even when the support from our chipset supplier will expire. And we already proved that we are serious about that, because our Fairphone 2, which has been launched in 2015, just received an Android update after almost 7 years. And this is really a first in the industry, because nobody has ever done this before, because it is quite challenging to keep the software supported when the chipset provider doesn't support you in that anymore.
That's wonderful to hear. In the perfect world, Thea, or a better world, how long should a phone last? So we're seeing you're pushing it out to about 7 years. I read somewhere, phones really should last 10 years. Is that a target? Or like if we get our act together in 2030, you buy a phone, and we really, we're treating the world in a better way. Will we be expecting that phone that we buy in 2030 to last until 2040?
I would really hope so. So, because currently the average is somewhere between 2 to 3 years of smartphone use. And we at Fairphone have at least the goal for 5 years, but maybe even 7 years right now. But this is also, let's say, related to a lock-in in the system, because some components are just not made to last longer. This is why we have this repairability approach. So if you have, for example, a USB-C connector which you always need for charging, then this is just made to break in a certain moment. But if you can replace the whole part with a little spare part, then you can just reuse your phone for longer. And the same for the battery. So if you, for example, just replace your battery, you just need to use your phone 2 months longer. And then you are already break even with your environmental impact again, because it might be counterintuitive, because the battery is a relative big part, but this carbon footprint related to a battery is relatively small compared to if you would just directly exchange the whole phone. And so with using your phone for longer, so if you extended lifetime from, the current market average around 3 years to 5 years, then you already can save 31% of your carbon emissions or greenhouse gas emission impact per year. And that can even get up to 42% if you would even keep it for 7 years. And this is really why we support this so much. And we want to go, of course, further and further with that. And hopefully we'll get to 10 years of support and spare part availability.
That would be fantastic. So you mentioned the battery and the USB connector. I presume that's 2 of the 8 things that are now replaceable. Do you remember any of the other 6? Or because I think it would be interesting for people to know about the things that can potentially be replaced.
Yeah, of course, the screen is a very important part which needs often replacement, because the battery and the screen are 2 parts which usually, let's say, break the deal in using the smartphone for longer, because many people don't want to use a cracked screen or it doesn't work anymore after a certain while. And the battery is just a consumable. So after 2 to 3 years, depending on how often a phone is charged, the capacity of the battery will just increase strongly. And if you cannot replace it, it becomes very inconvenient if you have to carry around a power bank all the time with you, because your phone doesn't last long enough anymore. But then also if you have, for example, problems with your camera or your speakers, they can also be replaced. And that also allows, at least for a Fairphone, for a module upgrade. So for example, for Fairphone 3, you could also replace your old camera with a better camera model. so that it is not that you stop using your phone because the camera technology has developed on, but that you can just plug in a better camera model with the newer technology so that you still keep using the phone.
That's fantastic. I don't know if you saw the story there about a month ago about Apple's repair kit for its battery, and they sent out like 120 kg to two massive suitcases, and you needed to be a nuclear scientist to actually use all the equipment in them just to change the battery. So it's a massive improvement. What you're doing, so that's really wonderful to see. So you talked about legislation in general, I suppose, in the context of Europe, but globally as well. About loopholes in legislation which allow manufacturers to focus on profit rather than the environment. Are there any of those loopholes that you could explain a little bit or throw some light on?
Yeah, I think there is one, let's say, general, very big loophole in legislation that we have. And I would claim, without knowing all the legislation globally, that this probably accounts for every country, that currently the pricing of product just does not account for the full price of the product in environmental and in social terms. Because it is, for example, allowed to buy materials which are extracted under very polluting and socially unfair conditions, and then leave the countries and communities alone with dealing with these burdens of extracting the material. And according to legislation, it is also okay to pay people in your supply chain less than a living wage. And like this, manufacturers can very easily make profit because the pollution and social injustice happens somewhere else. And also, usually only risks are managed. For example, reputational and financial risks, if someone would find out what happened in the manufacturer supply chain and that the manufacturer knew. And we at Fairphone are really open about the issues in the electronic supply chain. And instead of looking away and trying to get around it, we follow an approach to engage with the people on the ground and to work on continuous improvements together in the practices that they have. Since we also need to acknowledge that this is the livelihood of so many people on the planet, that just switching to a less risky supply doesn't really change, and that this material also will still enter your supply chain. And in my opinion, legislation should ensure that manufacturers have to account for the full social and environmental costs. So meaning that these costs recognize the direct and indirect impacts, so on economics, the environment, health, and also the social costs of producing their products.
Yeah, it's a great and essential point, essentially, that we don't account for the true and total cost to the earth or of the materials or the societies from which they are drawn, and that we need to start doing that because of the long-term impacts this lack of proper accounting is resulting in. So then this new, you mentioned one of your articles about the new or the changes or modifications or review of the EU Eco-Design Directive. What would, if there was one thing that you wanted to make sure was in the next EU Eco-Design Directive, what would that be?
So in general, the goals of the directive are very close to Fairphone's mission. So we think that this is a really great opportunity for the European legislators to bring about change in the electronic industry. And we at Fairphone already prove that even for a small company, it is possible to design a modular device that is easy to repair and to provide spare parts at a reasonable price, to provide repair information to everyone, and to provide software support for many years. And we also gave our input to the respective working group in a position paper where we outlined where we still see room for improvement on this directive draft. And summarizing all the points would maybe go a bit too far. But for instance, we remark that manufacturers should explicitly be obliged to provide repair information and spare parts to everyone in an easily accessible manner and, for the information free of charge. Because this is currently not the case, as you were already mentioning an example. And why shouldn't it be as easy to order a spare part as just ordering a new product? But the impact would just be so much less on the environment and on people if you could just order spare parts like on our homepage from every manufacturer's brand.
That would be a great idea, and really, really important. So finishing off to you, there's been great, really insightful. If you're giving somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, personally, what could they do in relation to their phone in habits? We know, hold on to it, as long as possible, get it repaired. But is there any, if you were giving advice to people in looking after their phone, or is it better to change the battery earlier? Is there any, final tips or tricks that will likely prolong the life of a phone?
Yeah, well, I would not recommend to change the battery yearly because, we of course don't want to use more spare parts than necessary. But in general, I think it is very much related to choices that we make. For example, when we purchase a product, so that we really also include in our decision to buy a product or not, if it can be repaired and if the manufacturer will support the software and the hardware for a long time. And then also the decision if something breaks on a phone, that we really take the effort to see if it can be repaired, and that we don't think, oh, this costs 40% of a new phone. Why shouldn't I just already buy the next phone which is out there? And because right now, of course, it is sometimes reality that repairing a product is not that easy, but we should support all initiatives and possibilities that it can be repaired to show that consumers are really interested in keeping their phone for longer, for the environment, and in the end also for themselves, because we all live in this environment. So I think it is a lot about decisions that we make, and maybe sometimes taking the additional effort of doing things which are currently not very easy in the current system, like repairing a product, but still deciding to do it.
Yeah, that's a great summary. I think we all need to try and make that effort, and and get together in our workplaces as well. That I'd fascinating talk with this. I talked about Emilio Just Lebowski, and I asked him, "What do you think can change these things? Make for better digital design or electronics, or and he said that." In his opinion, it's citizen action. He says individuals on our own don't have a lot of. We should be trying to do the right thing, but to get citizen movements together, because he said from reading history, he's read a lot of history as well. Most of the good changes, either in seatbelts or in healthcare, pharmaceuticals, did not come from governments initially. Did not certainly come from the big companies. They came from citizen action. And that, there is a movement of right to repair, but if we could get even more citizen action around right to repair, that would really drive a positive agenda.
Yeah, I completely agree. And we as Fairphone are even also part of right to repair as the only smartphone manufacturer which is out there. And we fully support this campaign.
If you're interested in these sorts of ideas, please check out my book, Worldwide Waste, gerrymcgovern.com. To hear other interesting podcasts, please visit thisishcd.com.